Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our event tonight for Trouble the Saints. I am Christian. I'm one of the booksellers at Astoria Bookshop. I'm very excited to introduce both of our authors today. So before we begin, you can, whatever book is mentioned during the stream, you can buy it on our website at astoriabookshop.com, especially Trouble the Saints and the Book of Lost Saints on our website. And we have curbside pickup right now, and also we can deliver it, ship to you. So I'll go into our introductions for our two wonderful authors today. So Alaya Dawn Johnson has been recognized for her short fiction and YA novels, winning the 2015 Nebula Award for Best Novelette, A Guide to the Fruits of Hawaii, which also appeared in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. It's edited by Joe Hill. Her debut YA novel, The Summer Prince, was longlisted for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature. Her follow-up YA novel, Love is the Drug, won the Andre Norton Award in 2015. A native of Washington, D.C., Johnson is currently based in Mexico City, where she received a master's degree in Mesoamerican Studies and sings in a blues band. And Daniel Jose Older is the New York Times bestselling author of the young adult series Shadow Shaper Cypher, the Bone Street Roomba urban fantasy series, and the middle grade historical fantasy series Dactyl Hill Squad, and Star Wars Last Shot. He won the International Latino Book Award and has been nominated for the Crickets Prize, the Mythical Poet Award, the Locust Award, and the Andre Norton Award, and the World Fantasy Award, a lot of awards. Shadow Shaper was named one of Esquire's 80 books for every person to read. You can find his thoughts on writing read dispatches from his decade-long career as a New York City paramedic, and hear his music on his website, on YouTube, and on Twitter.
Hey!
Hey.
We don't get the benefit of the applause happening.
Yeah, I know, right?
I know, we'll just applaud for ourselves.
Yes.
Shit.
Yeah, man.
It's so good to talk to you. I'm so happy we're doing this event. For those of you that don't know, Alaya and I go way, way back to the early days of I don't know, the early days of
Earlier days.
What do you call those? The days before the pandemic.
Right?
Yeah, but that like hazy period of kind of whatever that was.
Interregnum.
Yes. But yeah, so I'm really happy we got to do this. I was so happy when Sarisi reached out, and I love your book, so we're gonna talk about that. But first, you're gonna read.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I'm just gonna jump right in. I'm gonna read you guys like a few pages from the very first chapter of Trouble the Saints, my new novel. First novel in 6 years, so I'm kind of excited.
Really?
And
Really? Oh, that's exciting.
yeah, it is, man. So I mean, way back. So so this I guess I could Trouble the Saints very briefly is a novel that is set in New York City right before the U.S. entrance into World War II. So in itself, a kind of interregnum period. Mm-hmm. And it follows the story of a woman from Harlem who is Black but is light-skinned and has passed for the last 15 years with the mob as a hit woman. And the novel begins when she gets a dream. And in this novel, which is historical fiction, but it has this kind of fantasy element, the dream gives people powers when if they get the dream when they're around like 10, 11 years old. And since she had her first dream, she has had this kind of uncanny ability to aim. And so she has used that to throw knives and kill people. And at the start of the novel, she gets her second dream. And when they say the second dream comes down, you and your lucky hands better play the numbers because your widow needs some money to pay for your casket. So she's kind of at this real crossroads trying to decide if she wants to continue with this life or escape it. She's been trying to escape it, but now things are coming down and she's not sure she can. Okay, so this is the very first chapter. Oh, Phyllis. It had been Dev's voice at the end of the dream. Just his voice, warning me against nothing I could see. Just his voice. pushing me awake and away from him again. He had only ever called me Phyllis in extremity. Mortal danger, orgasm. I wondered which it would be this time. Christ, said the dentist, jamming his cigarette into my silver ashtray and getting another. Christ, where's that lighter? I hate even thinking about Red Man, and you have to go and dream about him. He's not so bad, not like Victor. The dentist flinched. You know what they say, the things he's done? You just like him because he likes you. You and that snake girl, what's her name? Tamara, I said, not for the first time. The star of the famous snake dance at the Pelican Club was my best friend in the city. Lately, because my life has not tended to kindness, she'd also been Dev's girlfriend. But my own lover couldn't bother himself to remember the name of some Nero showgirl. I leaned over the dentist to take another cigarette too, but instead he caught up my hand and gently traced its scars. I hated when he did that, though I never stopped him. The dentist's hands were chapped with alcohol and smelled like rubber, while I rubbed mine with shea butter every morning, just like my mother. But his had done nothing worse than pull teeth and fix caps for Victor and his men. He found my scars to remind me of the necessary distance between us, the dentist and the hatchet girl. Are you going to take this job if it comes? Was it disgust that flattened his tone, or indifference? My heart shuddered uselessly, but I kept steady and kissed him behind his left ear the way he liked. He groaned. I wouldn't lose him. The dentist was my bargain. The dentist I could keep. It was easier to move through the world with him at my elbow than alone, when the doormen were more suspicious of women of my complexion. Unlike most white men of my acquaintance, he rarely let a bad word escape his lips about Negroes or even any other group. Besides, he was handsome enough and in possession of an understanding wife. For those qualities, I overlooked his other lapses as a lover, an aversion to cunnilingus, the ghoulish whiteness of his capped teeth, the faint but clinging scent of antiseptic. My dissatisfactions were, I knew, the inevitable neuroses of his profession, and considering those of my own profession, I was inclined to anticipatory forgiveness, hoping to get the same gold for myself. If I lost him, I wouldn't have an easy time finding an old man half so nice, not at 35, with my first grays wiggling out of my lie-made hair and the scars that only Dev might have loved. How long has it been since the last one, darling? Months, I said, not wanting to own the number. 7, which felt too long and too short. I took a breath before answering the other question. They're bad people, you know. That's all Victor gives me. Murderers and rapists, real scum. When I signed on with Victor, that was our deal. That I'd be more than a hatchet man. That I could make the world a better place. By killing people? You really believe that? I could hear Dev's voice in the silence. The dentist only nodded. Russian Vic's angel of justice, his holy knife. Pronounced carefully, like he was reading from a book. My fingers locked. Most people called me that first thing, Victor's angel, sometimes of justice, but only a few, the ones who had known me longest, called me his life. Where did you hear that? I asked. The dentist looked out the window. The Hindu bartender, Dev, right? Called you that once. Stuck in my head. Sounded more biblical when he said it, though. To Dev, there was no such thing as holiness in violence. I hadn't quite believed him when he first said so, not even when I let him take me from the city. He told me about karma and the weight of our past and present lives, but I only felt it long after. These days I avoided Victor. I refused jobs. I worried alone because I could not add to my ledger and I could not bury my knives. But Redman would visit soon. The dreams the hands give don't lie. I had to choose one more time. I could go back to Harlem, to the shabby familiarity of the old apartment complex on the corner of 130th and Lenox, move in with my sister Gloria and her husband Tom and their sweet kids. Redman would find me there, but he'd leave me alone if I asked. I wouldn't have Dev, and I wouldn't have the knives, and I wouldn't have everything I hated and loved about being Victor's angel of justice. Gloria loved me, but she wouldn't open her home to a murderess, not even her sister. Aren't you afraid? The dentist asked. For a jittery moment, I thought he had read my mind, or seen my ghosts. Lenox Avenue, the Tony apartments on Sugar Hill around the corner, afternoon number runs for Madame Stephanie and the Barkley brothers, the barber shops and the stoops and the rent parties and buffet flats that lasted till morning, the sex and the poetry, policy slips like numbered confetti and the silk purse bound tight by my garter. But the dentist only knew Phyllis LeBlanc, not Phyllis Green. Afraid of the second dream, he said, when I just stared at him. My voice cracked on a laugh. It's just superstition. I know someone with the hands in Uptown who's had 4. Most white folks had either never heard of or didn't believe in the hands, but the white men in Victor's service all believed. or at least were good at faking it. The dentist gave a very sour smile. Or a Russian Vic who's had, what is it now, 7? This was a bit of a joke, too dark and too dangerous to make it any other hour. Victor claimed he had the hands, but no one quite believed him. He would make announcements of his dreams, listing out his visions of those who had betrayed him. You learned to fear those if you wanted to last. The dentist fell asleep, and I stayed awake for a little while longer. 10 years ago, I had walked away from the happiest life I would ever know for the sake of a pair of hands. And now, if I had dreamed true, Red Man would bring me another set. I wondered if I could make a different choice.
Oh, man. Again, there's no... Are those other dogs?
Oh,
Those
my
your dog?
No. When my dog barks, I hope she won't. It'll be much louder.
No, I have 3 and same.
Yeah.
Exactly. I love that so much. Man, I have so many questions. I'm trying to organize them all in my head. I was going to start one place, but now that you read that chapter, I want to start somewhere else. So I want to ask you about that chapter, actually. Like, there's so much in that. Was that always the first chapter?
Yeah, that opening scene, let's say I massaged some of the details, but that kind of basic setup was always a setup.
And then from there, like you do a lot of different things in terms of time, you know, in part because it's historical, but also you're just jumping back and forth in time, you know, in a number of different ways. Right. Did you kind of like, you knew you were going to do that as you set out. Were you very organized with it, or did you just kind of go and see what happened?
Some of the time games were really built into the premise because, as you can tell kind of from that excerpt, right, like we're very much between this present, which is 10 years after her ex-lover Dev tried to take her from the city and it didn't work.
Right.
And 15 years from when she started passing and working as a hatchet girl. Right. So we're kind of, she's constantly in tension with those two moments. Like she's constantly thinking back to and regretting and wondering about her choices that night 10 years ago when she decided to go back to the city and kill, even though she'd agreed not to. And that kind of ended her relationship with Dev. And then the 15 years before when she decided to make this agreement with Victor, thinking that it was all just going to be like a kind of lark, you know? Right. And now she's 35 and it's very different looking down at her life now than it was before, when it was all kind of more abstract to her, when she just had this ability and she just had to get out and she had to do something different. And she keeps telling herself, oh, I'm making the world better, right? But as you can tell, even in that excerpt, she's kind of started to wonder how true that is, you know? Right. So to part of the tension of that time, like the present time and these two past moments are just constantly kind of bubbling up in her narrative.
Right. And you feel that it's like she's yearning for that time, not out of nostalgia, but out of like almost a curiosity about regret. Like constantly like wondering, did I make the right choice? Was it ever going to be like the story, just the story of like 10 years ago or 15 years ago? Or was it always like 35 looking back?
It was always 35 looking back. For some reason, she came into my head, Phyllis, very much like very strong character. And it was always that. It's interesting because I started writing her because it took me 7 years to write this novel. So when I started writing this novel, I was younger than her. And so I was, you know, I only ever written younger protagonists, even my adult work, they were kind of young. And so I wanted to write an older woman, and I'm not that old, obviously, but older than like the 22-year-old ingenues I've been writing before.
As a 40-year-old, I hope we're not calling a 35-year-old.
Right. I mean, listen, I'm 38 now, but it's just funny because when I started, I was 30, 31. And so I was like, you know, you know, but to me, I wanted to have, but she was very, very much a character who was looking back. She always was. Because to me, I think that's kind of one of the elements of noir, or that you can kind of get into with noir, which I love a lot, which is regret. Yeah. Which is having enough experience to look back. And that's kind of the antithesis of YA. And since I've been doing so much YA, I was really into that.
I love that. That's true. That's very true. Yeah, and it's so noir, and that chapter is so noir, just like right off the bat, right? Like immediately, I feel like you're signaling to us that it's not YA because you're talking about oral sex, which, like, you know, I guess YA has done that now, but like, you know, you're letting people know. And then B, you're just leaning into the noir, like, you know, really heavily in a great way. But also I feel like from a point of view that we're not always seeing in noir. And even the way that it's like such a small thing, but I feel like it brings the chapter to life in so many ways. That moment when, you know, she's letting him like run his finger along the scar, but she hates it. And she's bringing us into that moment as the reader. So it's very intimate. Like you're really, as a character, confiding in us. But also like, I feel like that's such a play on like dudes that love to like caress scars and like that obnoxious trope of like dudes that like your scars are so beautiful, you know, and like
right.
You're going for the throat, which is great. But were you thinking about that, like noir and like also kind of fucking with noir at the same time?
Yeah, I always called this my anti-noir novel, you know, for years.
That's great. That's great. For me, the moment. It's like I haven't finished the book on purpose because I didn't want to finish it like in a hurry. So, and I was like really in love with the book. So I was like, let me slow down. Cause you know how your brain reads differently when you have I was like, let me stop reading. So don't spoil anything. But I very explicitly like remember the moment I was like, I really love this book. I loved it from jump, but there's this moment when you jump into second person very early on. So not, you know, and it's the saints talking to her. And then there's a conversation. It was that moment, and then immediately after, there's a conversation she has with Deb in the hospital. That's like so devastating and nuanced. And I feel like there were so many directions to go with it that you didn't, and you just like it was surprising on every level. And I had to put the book down and just process because I was so excited about it. But my question for you is like, what was the moment as a storyteller that you fell in love with the story that you were like, okay, this is definitely what I'm doing? And I realize now it was 7 years ago, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, this story, it's interesting because it's such a layered story, and the process of writing it was so layered, like it was so complicated, like all of these scenes. Almost any scene, right? I mean, the story of how I wrote that scene is a story of 1 year I did one layer, and then the next 2 years later I came back and I like tried to figure out exactly what it was. You know, I mean, so there's a lot of weird. I don't know. In a way, all of my novels are obviously I edit them a lot, but this one was off the hook, and so it's interesting that you mentioned that scene, the conversation with Deb in the hospital. Now, this is always so difficult when I'm talking about this book because there's part of me that wants to just sort of dig in and like open it all up, but you know, I don't
open it up.
Yeah, I don't want to like spoil it for everybody, but I that particular scene, like that particular scene and the conversation he has, partly because part of that conversation, this is me like trying to not do too much, but part of that conversation is one that he has when he isn't aware that she's listening to him.
Right.
And then they finish it when, you know, he's kind of pretending that he didn't have that first conversation with her.
Right.
And
she checks him on it quick.
Right, yeah, you know, and she herself isn't entirely sure that it was real, but then she realizes it is. And so, and that whole interaction, like that sequence of him kind of avoiding her, then coming to the hospital and telling her something just because he thinks she can't hear him, and then that forcing them into a level of intimacy that they have been kind of rigorously avoiding for the last decade. I love that sequence. Like, I gotta tell you, that was one of those things where no matter where this novel went, I was like, I gotta keep this. I have to make this work. Like, I have to make this scene work. Like I had this whole thing, and there's this whole motif of these purple watermelons, which are real, and I just kind of kept going back and back and back. Because it's just a lot of layers. There was a lot of moving parts. Like, in a weird way, I feel when I think back to because this originally started out as a novella. I thought that the first section was just going to be a standalone novella, and it just never worked. Like it kind of kept almost working, you know, and until I said, you know what, I think I just need to listen to myself and keep writing it, because I apparently just cannot end the story there.
Was that just you, or was an editor pushing back? Like, no.
I mean, no. Are you joking? Are you joking, Daniel? What editor was going to say? You know what you should do, Alaya? Take a noir novella, and then, as somebody who also liked the book put it, but I thought it was hilarious. Like, and then write 200 pages of epilogue.
It worked.
You know, if it works, I really. So the idea of me doing this really, to me, seemed like hugely risky, like not risky in terms of craft, like risky just as a writer, but also risky in terms of career and sellability. And like, I'm attempting to make a living off of my words. And so writing a whole 3-part like novel sequence, which each part with like its own particular kind of subplot that resolves, but that also speaks to the larger story. I mean, all of that was just wildly complex, and it wasn't something I'd done before. And so it was a real risk for me to just say, fuck it.
Did something happen that like made you, I mean, besides, I feel like you were following the thread of the novel and that's how you ended up there. And do you also feel like there were seeds of that in your processes with other books that led you to be like, you know what, I need to do something different? Asking for a friend who is me.
I have to say this particular novel really was me saying, I think you're right. Like, let's keep going with this thing that has worked before, which is to say that with my YA novels, The Summer Prince and Love is a Drug, I was in both cases like really going off the path in a lot of ways. I just decided I wanted to write those novels, which at first blush were not the sorts of things that were really selling or that people wanted to buy. And so I was kind of taking a lot of risks by especially when I was writing them, I feel like now maybe it's a little less, it seems less risky now, but like imagine 2010, okay? Because I promise it was not really like the exact same market. So I feel like, and it ended up working out, it really, I was really proud of those books and weren't bestsellers or anything, but I was pleased with how they did. And I felt that, I stayed true to myself and it worked. Because of that, the books did fairly well. There was kind of some momentum building. I had just moved to Mexico and I was thinking that I really had to produce a new YA novel. That was what was next on my plate. I needed a new YA. And I had an idea. And the funny thing about this idea, it's not a bad novel. I mean, I'm sure that there's some iteration of this novel that's a good novel. The problem was that because I felt all that kind of external pressure to produce this novel, I ended up like jumping the gun. I usually spend a lot more time developing and building, and I didn't because I felt a lot of pressure. And so I remember these horribly long hours in the coffee shop, just sort of like pounding away and writing scenes. And one day I kind of stopped and looked back at what I'd written. I'd written some like 30,000 words, like a huge chunk of the novel. And I was like, what is happening? I have no idea what's happening. The story hasn't even started. And the most interesting character is the main character's ex-girlfriend who you never see.
How we do ourselves.
And it's just like, what? And I thought maybe I could write the ex-girlfriend story. And I'm like, no, like even that doesn't work. Like none of this is working, And I just felt like really lost. And so that was when I had a conversation with another writer, and we were all just kind of just talking, and I just mentioned this sort of like existential angst, and she said, maybe you just don't write that. I'm like, ha ha ha, what are you talking about? I have to write this.
30,000 words.
Like I have to continue and like build in a novel a year and whatever. And I came back to Mexico City and I just said, what if I don't write it? And and it was really clear. It was like, if I don't write it, I took a deep breath and I said, I get to work on my Phyllis novel. Like that was it. Like that was that was what kind of sprung onto me, was that this weird book with its weird structure that was very complicated to deal with and write was the book I wanted to write, like easily. And so that kind of flow, that freedom, it did. I mean, it definitely was inspired by the fact that that kind of had worked before, but it definitely took a lot of convincing. I mean, it was maybe 6 months of me trying to work on the other one before I just said, that's it.
Wow. That is alone an amazing saga. I love that. So wait, the 30,000 words are just gone? Are they ever going to be anything?
I mean, like right now, no. I'm writing another YA novel. It's totally different. It's totally different. It's like a deep, like 4,000 years in the future, super space opera novel. So
to the Star Wars side.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I'm so excited about this book. I'm so excited.
It's great. I love that feeling. And I also love that feeling of, it's like, you know, it's like a good breakup. Like when you leave something behind that you're like, all right, you know, it hurts sometimes, and there's a moment of like it stings, but then you're just like, oh, but I'm free. Like,
yes.
So what was the whole, like, what was it about this story that, besides like that it was, maybe it was just destructive, but was there a particular like single image that really was like, this is the story like that I need to tell?
You know what? It really was just Phyllis. It was P. It was just, I desperately wanted to write her story. I wanted to do justice to her story. One of the novels that I most loved, that most impacted me when I was growing up, is very bizarrely, but I love this series so much, is the LionChronicles by Dorothy Dunnett, which is kind of super dense historical fiction about the world's most charismatic Scotsman in the 15th century. It is sort of like the series for so many fabulous historical fiction and fantasy fiction. You know, a lot of writers have been really influenced by Dorothy Dunn and in this series in particular. And so the LionChronicles really just was a sort of touchstone novel for me. I kind of grew up reading it in a weird way, in this kind of more literal sense. Like, I was 17 when I first started reading it, and I kind of did not understand much, especially of the themes that she was dealing with. And I finished the series at 24 or something, and there was a really marked difference in my ability to track what was going on in that story and the kind of deep themes of it. But I mention it because one of the kind of key things it does, it's extremely hard to pull up. I mean, I knew it was kind of tricky at 17, and now, you know, at 38, I'm like, my God, I don't know how she did it. Is that she has a 7-book series with, you know, I don't know how many thousands of pages, like 4,000 pages or something, of a main character who is absolutely the heart of this series. And you're not never in his point of view, but you are very rarely in his point of view. You are in his point of view in each book, maybe a grand total of 20, 25 pages.
What?
Yes.
Wow.
And it's all through this kaleidoscopic vision of the people around him. And he's so charismatic that it makes sense that all of the people around him have these kind of super strong opinions of him, but they're not all like, you know, I love him. A lot of them despise him. So you read whole novels from the point of view of people who despise him, but are around him a lot. And so they're kind of filtering everything that he does through this prism of how much they loathe him. In some ways, you know, they see him more clearly than a lot of people who are, you know, totally worship him. But you also see the way that they kind of distort and misread things. And there's always a point in those novels where you realize that he was doing something that you never understood because the viewpoint through which you were seeing him was totally different. And I love that because I loved, you know, the extent to which she just takes as a given that this is a character who absolutely merits this level of in-depth study. Of this, all of these people have this many, you know, strong opinions about him. Takes that for granted, you know. It's just all this stuff that I thought to myself, you know, listen, we see this for white men all the time, right? But I mean, how many Black women get a character study, are allowed to be as complex and make as many bad and good decisions, but not just, you know, to be like strong and you know, I kill people, so don't mess with me, you know, but like really, really weird and messed up and also beautiful and loving and strong, like all of these qualities. And that was why I just desperately wanted to write Phyllis, because I wanted to write a character who was as complicated and as charismatic in her own way as Lyman.
Right.
And I wanted that character to be a Black woman. And then, and through her deal with this issue of passing, which was something I just kind of always been interested in exploring in a literary way and could never quite figure out, you know, how to do it. And then this was so clearly the way to do it.
Wow. That's amazing. Did you, I find when I'm writing it, like people always ask about like how to kind of figure out violence, right? And I find it to be a very gut and instinctive question because each book is so different, let alone each writer. Did you find writing Phyllis that you would go a little too far in one direction or the other? Because there's a danger to both sides, right? Like you can go overboard and have her just like massacre people in a way that feels really uncomfortable, but you can also have her be too treacly and like do-gooder about it. And that's, but you played it like really on the line in a way that really works. But was that trial and error, or did you just know and it just came out right?
I would say it was certainly the first part. Her section was I just felt it. Like I just understood her dilemma was so clear in my mind that it was very clear that she was someone who was used to violence, who almost defaulted to it, but was so desperately trying to move away from it that it was creating this kind of huge conflict, this internal conflict. And that really just guided exactly how I did it. And so someone pointed out to me, which was not something I had really like understood super consciously, which is hilarious to me. I'm not sure how, but that she doesn't use violence in the present action of the novel.
Right.
She uses violence in the past.
Right.
She threatens violence, but she doesn't actually, the most she does is she hits the like BB gun of some white kid who's been threatening them with a stone. Like that's it. And even that she feels kind of weird about, because she's been trying so hard to get away from the violence that to her came so easily before. And so I think part of that, like the reason why it was a little easier to walk with her was because she had done it all. Like she'd been as violent as a character could be, she was like a Quentin Tarantino character violent for in the past of the novel. And so, in that scene that you mentioned in second person, like that's a scene where she's more violent and she's surrounded by violence. There's other moments in the past where she's, like the reason why she and Dev break up is a very violent reason.
Right.
Right. But in her case, it was just every time that she had to be violent, it was one of those moments. It was something where it was clear that this was just how she lived. And it was something that she tried very hard not to question, but I had to just demonstrate it. I had to show it in a graphic enough way that the reader could understand why it was that she'd switched off in a certain way, that she couldn't do it.
Yeah, I felt that, and I think it's sort of personified in Dev, and in a weird, ambiguous, complicated relationship with Dev, and I think that's also why those two scenes back to back kind of jump out so much. Is that like also they're really big clarifying moments in the text, so it's like suddenly you know exactly who the bad guy is, because up to that point it was like it wasn't clear, which I love. Like it's like, who are we dealing with? Like who are we up against? It's very ambiguous, right? And then suddenly we know very clearly who is the motherfucker that needs to die. And she does that, which I love too. And then we also are like, oh, Dev is also the motherfucker that we want everybody to end up with. Like it's just like and like structurally I thought that just felt so cool because it took a second to get there. It's not like it's deep in the book, but it's like you're wandering through it and then it like clicks. I love that. All right, we are actually very similar. We have a lot in common, and so I'm gonna bother you with questions that people always bother me with. They don't really bother me, but but I'm curious too about your answers because we both write for adults and for teenagers.
Yeah.
And everyone always wants to know what the difference is, and I still don't have a good answer. Like some shit is for teenagers, you know what I mean? Like if the main character is a teenager, it's a YA. That's kind of how I roll. But that's also sort of a cop out. Like I think we do actually strategize about voices. So I don't know. Do you have an answer that makes sense so I can steal it?
Yeah, Daniel. We're in the same boat. I really do kind of like wander through answers because it's very complicated. I mean, part of me just wants to say, listen. I mean, if the protagonist is a teenager, but then I'll read a novel that has a teenage protagonist and is so not YA, and then I'm forced to say, okay, well, not every book that has a teenage protagonist is YA. I right now, the thing that I've kind of hit on, which I think is speaking to me, who knows what I'll say in 5 years, is that when I write YA is about a character going through the things that they will need to dissect with their therapist for the next 30 years. Like that's the present action.
Yeah.
Whereas adult fiction is somebody who is living in the consequences or downstream from a lot of those major defining seminal moments.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that works. That works. Does your voice change when you realize you're writing a YA? Do you write a different voice?
Each novel has a different voice, so that's I try to start there. I try to just say like, who is this character, and not worry too much about marketing. I'm not saying it doesn't show up in my brain, but I try to like push it as far aside as I can.
The reality is that we have to deal with as writers.
Right, exactly. Like I'm trying to publish in the world, and I don't want to just like leave them on my hard drive, but I do try to not let it really guide too much of my thinking, especially in the early stages. And so the voice, I think the voice modulates itself. I'll say this, that Phyllis and Dev and Tamara's voices, they're distinct, but they're very all adult. And I think it's because, I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like myself, don't get me wrong, but I feel like, myself at 17 had a very specific urgency or immediacy that that now it's just changed. It's kind of naturally changed and mellowed and modulated. And I try to go back and capture that when I'm trying to write a character who's younger.
What about when you're head jumping though? Like, is there a moment when you have it, and then you can go, or do you sort it out as you go?
I have managed to avoid this almost entirely in my YA by writing them in first person or extremely close third. Right. I just don't jump heads. I'm like, no, that's just right. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I don't know if it would be harder for me to differentiate the voices if I did a YA novel the way I wrote Trouble with the Saints. Right.
But I mean, for Trouble with the Saints, like when you were writing that, like, did you have a moment where you're like, okay, now I got it, or did you just sort it out?
In the head jumping?
Yeah.
Oh man, that was a doozy. My God.
You didn't do that when you started out on the journey?
Oh, I mean,
No, you didn't, because you thought it was just a novella. Sorry.
I thought it was just a novella. Like, exactly. I thought it was a novella. And then I said, I have to keep going. Okay, so do I keep going in her head, or do I keep going in someone else's head? And it was really clear to me that I wanted the next part to be Dev's story. I mean, that as soon as like the question occurred to me, I said, oh, I want to see this through Dev's eyes. And the first draft, it's ironic. I mean, my friends have read this in various moments over the last 7 years. And so I feel like, unfortunately, some friends have like a really odd idea of this novel because they just happen to catch it like a kind of unformed blob. Like, they were so helpful to me, but they haven't really, I don't think they realize how much it changed. But so like the first section was more defined and firm because that was the first one. That was the one I thought through most. And then, Dev's section and Tamara's section, they headed in the direction I wanted to go, but they didn't get there. Right. Mm-hmm. And part of what was so hard was the voice. It was that I just as I said, I kind of had spent so much time writing entirely first person narratives that I could get like the main character's voice, but I hadn't really exercised my differentiate character voices muscles a lot. And it was so it definitely took a lot of rewriting. I mean, I rewrote Dev's section twice. And major rewrites. I mean, just like overhauling rewrites. And it was really interesting. The moment that I got it, I mean, I remember that really clearly too, when I just knew I had it and I loved Dev and I was like in love with everything and I'm the best writer and everything was great. That was
love that moment.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, it's like we just live for that, because otherwise it's just sitting there going like, why is this so hard? Yes. So my moment was when I realized that part of my problem was that I never actually thought through Dev's side of things when they'd met. That, like, I mean, again, I'm trying not to spoil things here, but basically, he reveals something to her in the course of the first story, which really upends her idea of Dev and what he's been doing in her life.
And what happened between them? And what happened between them? Like, why
exactly
based on her? Anyway,
right. No, exactly. Like their relationship, like everything, just totally upended by something he reveals to her. And so I realized when I'd written his story, I just kind of took that as a kind of detail instead of the obvious super central major element that needed to be resolved. And so when I went back and I thought to myself, like, well, what was he doing? But actually, what was he doing? And I said, well, maybe I could just write what he was doing. And that was when I came up with like the structure of the flashbacks where, you know, he's living through in kind of over the course of his section. It has a present section, and in his case, a very delineated past section where you kind of see exactly in a moment how he saw the moment that they met, and and everything he was doing, and his life, his double life. And when I realized that I could have one of these moments where you just flip everything, and the story that I told is now a completely different story, even though it's the same story. Like, that was when I said, oh my gosh, yes, yes, yes. And his voice, like that, it was just, you know, I mean, I did not have his voice at all until I started writing those sections, and it just came.
Wow, I love that. Man, I swear, people should write books about the liner notes. You know what I mean? Like, every book takes on the author's journey to writing the book. I know that's a whole
yeah, right. Like the director. What do you call those things? Like the commentary track on the DVD.
Yeah, like the writer in the background being like, "Oh, this part was fucked up. Let me tell you this I was going through when I wrote this." Like, I always want to know. Let me shout out that we're gonna do. If you guys have questions, you guys, I'm talking to an empty room. I'm never gonna get used to this. I've been doing events now for how many months, like in pandemic world, and I'm still like, it still feels really surreal. Just be like, hey, you guys, I'm just not in the YouTube.
Hi, world. You know, I'm like sitting here staring at the palm trees in front of my house, like, okay, you know.
But anyway, if you guys out there in the world have questions, throw them in the comments or don't. You know, it's up to you. But we're gonna keep going. But you know, yeah, there we go. So I did want to ask about music because we're also both musicians, and I always get the question of like, how does it all come together in your head, right? Like, do you bring music into the process of writing in a very literal way? Like, do you listen to music while you write, or are you thinking of music while you're writing prose? Like, are they just totally separate for you? How does it work?
You know, it's interesting. I love this question. I love this question.
I sounded like I was like slamming it, but it's a great question.
Yeah, no, just because for me, it's kind of relatively new. I've always loved singing, like I you know, but I never managed to figure out how to make that whole thing work and write songs and sing with other people and overcome my crippling stage fright and actually, you know, sing in front of people and everything. I mean, it was really moving to Mexico that kind of broke that open suddenly. I mean, literally, like I brought a child's guitar with me when I went basically backpacking over, you know, through the south of Mexico, and that was the first few weeks. I spent like 5 weeks there, and I ended up I started writing songs. Like, that was it. It was just, I landed in Cancun, got out of there as quickly as possible, and started writing songs. And it's really strange. It was really strange. And I wonder, now that you mentioned that, I'm like, you know, that was also when I decided to continue writing what I thought was my novella and keep going. And that turned into Trouble the Saints. You know, it was this moment of creative explosion for me, basically, of wanting to really try new things and break boundaries. So I feel like that's kind of what music means to me at this point. It's a sort of creative outrush, you know, or just breaking things down. So I do listen to music when I write. I discovered that I tend to listen to music I find kind of blander when I write, like music I don't have to pay that much attention to, because I notice, I'm like, don't you love?
What do you mean?
I mean, listen, this is not me just saying, like, you know, people's musical tastes are bad or anything, but there's a certain music that I like listening to, but I don't love listening to it. And for whatever reason, that is like a sweet spot at which I can just sit and work.
You're not going to name names, though, are you?
Yeah, I feel kind of bad, but
I won't get you canceled. But, that's hilarious. So it's like, because you don't have to pay too close attention to it. If you love it, you're like, it pulls you.
Yeah, because like, for example, I love Stevie Wonder. Like, I love Stevie Wonder. But I thought to myself, why don't you ever listen to Stevie Wonder while you're working?
Right.
And that's exactly why, because every time I put Stevie on, I'm suddenly just like rocking out and I'm not working at all. So I have to,
Right.
I have to pick something where I'm not going to feel like so into it.
Yeah. The mediocre playlist. That's hilarious.
It's like, it's good. I like that song, right? But I just realized, because I was looking at some songs and I thought to myself, how is it possible I listened to this song 60 times? Like, that is just, what? And like, that is not possible, but it's because I wasn't paying that much attention to it.
Spotify, are you on Spotify? Because they send you that end of the year like rundown, and it like tells you all kinds of things about yourself you didn't know.
I mean, thank God I'm not on Spotify. Oh my God, I'm sure I'd be like so embarrassed. No, I'm on Google Music, and they just every once in a while I'll just look at my playlist and I'll see the count next to it. And I'm like, no, that's not possible.
For me, every year it's D'Angelo. Like, I listen to more D'Angelo because he's good for travel, he's good for writing, he's good for any extracurricular activities you might have. Like, D'Angelo's just the best. But yes, I find like, because I listen to house sometimes when I'm writing, and I love house, but I'm not a house fan. You know what I mean? But It just moves in a way that like it's not trying to get your attention. It's just going, and then if you find that right mix.
No, and I have mixes, where I say, listen, I love these songs, and I'll sometimes listen to them, but I'll also suddenly find myself going right back to the playlist of music that I find like fine, but not that exciting, because otherwise I just spend too much time paying attention to it. So,
that's hilarious. Actually, I don't think I've ever heard a writer say that. I like the mediocre shit when I'm writing. That's just okay. Let's think. Huh? Oh, no. Okay, let's take this question. From Alicia Fernandez. Do you have tips for putting ideas in your head into writing? Do you just start in? Thanks. I'm so excited for this book.
Ooh, thanks, Alicia. Tips. I mean, my best tip is, however you can, like, attempt to get started, like, write a sentence, write characters out. I mean, maybe more concretely, like, pick the thing that you have most clear, so if like the world is the part that you are most excited about, start diagramming or drawing pictures or writing that out as much as you can. If the characters are maybe, character profiles or little dialogue, sometimes I've done that between characters who I couldn't figure out like how they spoke. I started just like writing like plays with them, where they're talking to one another, because I just could not figure out how else to do it.
Right.
So it also kind of depends on what stage you're in. When you're just planning, that kind of stuff is great. There's writers, I know, who love planning. I mean, they'll just have books upon books and notebooks like stacked this high of like all the world building and details and like extra scenes they've written, but they haven't actually written a sentence of the actual book, and that's a different problem.
That's true. Yep, that's so true. So wait, do you outline?
I have a weird like approach to outlining. I've never quite understood if that is considered outlining. I've decided I think it is, but it's like free forming outlining, where I write like my general idea of what the book is going to be, and then I have like a really like detailed, like, let's say, first chapter where I'm like writing everything I possibly can, and that like about what is going to happen in the first chapter, and then like the second chapter is a little less detailed. And then I start writing, and then let's say a third of the way through the first chapter, I realize that all that doesn't really work, or that there's a problem. And so then I go back and I just start writing again, and I just start like free writing until I get to like fixing that problem, and I keep going. So I just kind of keep rewriting the outline.
Wow. That's so interesting.
Like, I mean,
I love it.
I never could figure out that this is like, I'm a plotter or a pantser. Like, every time I see those things online, I'm like, yeah, I don't know.
You're a meticulous pantser.
I'm a meticulous pantser. That's great. That's perfect. That's exactly what I am.
Really what you are. That's your new band name too.
Right. Coming soon.
That's super interesting, because I think the answer to the question too for Alicia is like, it's so, what you said is it's so different for every writer. You know what I mean? Not only different for every writer, but different for every book. Because like I found like there's books that I gotta really make the world and draw it a lot and do all kinds of cartoons, and then there's worlds that books that I will literally just sit down and start writing with no real concept of what's going to happen. And you have to follow your gut, like, because that's really what knows. And sometimes it's terrifying, because so for some people, the idea of just starting a book with no material is like really scary, but also what needs to happen in order for you to get to that material part, I found. But yeah, we have another question. What kind of research did you do for the world building for Trouble the Saints?
Okay, so the main research I did was into kind of 1940s, well, okay, underworld, 1940s. So there was a lot of and more specifically in Harlem. So there's a lot of stuff about numbers running, like policy, basically, and how that worked, and the kind of big players, and how that played into the kind of nascent NAACP and the there was a lot of stuff happening with civil rights long before the civil rights movement that when it really exploded to the public consciousness in the 60s, and numbers running, and those people who kind of made their fortune in the 20s in this kind of huge explosion of creative life in Harlem in the 20s had a huge impact on that. And so it all kind of came together. And there's also elements of conjure, especially as practiced in African American community in Harlem and in other Black neighborhoods in New York City. And so I spent a lot of time kind of digging into that, is specifically because of Tamara, who has this role as an oracle and is sort of in communication with the saints or the ancestors over the course of this novel. And so that kind of informed that bit of I mean, that's a fantastical element of the story. It's not historical, but it is very much informed by a lot of those traditions and these divinatory traditions that were huge in the Black community. I mean, they still are, but specifically in the days of policy, because that really isn't played anymore. As far as I know, I mean, it'd be amazing to find someone who is still playing policy, but basically, they would pick three numbers. Everybody would pick three numbers, and you would give your little slips to numbers runners, and they would bring them to the banks, and then your numbers would be checked against basically random number generators, but they would use various numbers that just appeared regularly in the paper. And so one of them was the mutuels, which was, I believe, like a kind of horse racing figure that they would come up with every day. And when they stopped printing that in a way that worked, they would use the last three digits of like the decimal place in the mutuels. And when that stopped working, I think they used like an aggregate number for the Dow Jones Industrial Average or something. Wow. They would just use these random numbers, and then if your number was picked, then you won. Sometimes quite a lot. Sometimes it really did help people absolutely kind of change their lives. And it was exactly the way in not, they were not magic in their hands, but in the sense in which in the book I discuss how the hands is like a little bit of luck to get ahead, something that they can't take from us, that allows us to get ahead even in the midst of this kind of really oppressive system. That was really what policy did. And that was why it produced all of these huge characters with a lot of social and economic and political power in Harlem, and why when Dutch Schultz and white mobsters muscled their way into the policy racket and took over the Black banks in a way that is very similar to how I dramatized it in Trouble the Saints. That really changed and was one of these kind of like moments of really gutting the Black community, even though policy was not legal. It wasn't mob business. It wasn't violent.
Right.
And it really changed.
Wow.
So that was like a lot of the research that I did was into that kind of stuff, and how all of that related to the kind of classic period of white mobsters in New York, like the Dutch Schultz, and then and when he was killed in these conflagrations. So a lot of that kind of spins in there too. And otherwise, I read novels set in the time period, but like written by people in the time period. I attempted to just sort of like what I was most interested in was a feeling, was the kind of sense of being there, but not from the perspective of a white person, And so that was really what I was like most trying to get at. Yeah, and there were other little details, but those were the kind of the big things.
Right. Question for my wife, actually. Brittany Williams asks, did you run into any internalized misconceptions writing historical fiction with Black characters? Was there any negative image you were working against?
All right, that's great. So the internalized misconceptions, I'd say like the biggest one that I don't know if I ran into it directly with this, but you never know about indirectly, is just this general notion that you're just being like ahistorical, or like it isn't like, what's the point of writing about Black characters in the 40s or in the 20s or in, you know, Regency England or whatever. I mean, that just comes up all the time. And you know, and it's really frustrating. I mean, it's frustrating just because it's totally wrong, but it's also frustrating because the people saying it are often like so convinced they're on the side of like historical accuracy, and they're not.
Right.
And so you're just like, it's like fighting like an extremely wrong pedant is the worst kind of pedant to fight. So that was definitely kind of, that was something I was in general like interested in fighting against, or working against, in the sense of I wanted to write a historical piece that centered Black and not white characters, that dealt with their experiences in that time period, that really got at issues that continue to be extremely relevant today. I mean, would be no matter what, but let's just say 2020 has really dramatized a lot of stuff that I was writing about.
Right.
And so that was, you know, it's not to say that doesn't show up in historical fiction, because it does, but there's a certain kind of popular strain of historical fiction in which you just don't see these characters. They just don't show up.
Yes.
They just don't show up. It's like this Mad Men kind of vision of the past. And, you know, and Mad Men is even later than this novel. And it's just like,
right.
You bring up that critique, and it's all just, but how could they? Or, oh, it would just be, you know, so hard. Or, oh, they couldn't because they just, you know, weren't in those spaces. You know, just all these weird, not true sort of swamp-like arguments where you're just constantly trying to like drag yourself out of them like that.
Yeah, man, that's real. Well, thank you so much. This has really been wonderful. I'm really happy we got to talk.
Thank you, Daniel. This is great.
Long time.
Yeah.
And yeah, everybody pick up your copy. There's links at the top of the thread, and support independent bookstores and support this particular independent bookstore, Astoria Bookshop.
Yes, thank you so much, Astoria Bookshop, for hosting us. This is wonderful.
Yeah. All right. See y'all later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, guys.